Okay, we go at the same time.
Yeah, okay. One more time. This time for sure. It's okay, we got this. Now! 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 One more time. It's okay, we got this.
So for years I've pretty much said that Resident Evil 4 is the best game ever. I've played through the original game probably 9 or 10 times because I use my time wisely, obviously. So they remade Resident Evil 2 in 2019 and it was a huge success. And so every company ever decided to remake every horror game ever. And then they remade Resident Evil 3 and it wasn't really that great. And then they decided to remake Resident Evil 4. And I was more horrified at the prospect of them remaking Resident Evil 4 than I was by anything in the original game. I was really scared that basically the team at Capcom would change one thing about the original Resident Evil 4, and then they would change another thing, and then they would change another thing, and by the end it would be completely unrecognizable as Resident Evil 4. And honestly, that's kind of what happened, but in the best way possible. They kept the basic premise, a lot of the story elements, some of the levels are pretty close to the originals, while others are completely changed. And so yeah, this new Resident Evil 4 is not at all the same thing as the original Resident Evil 4. But the thing is, it's better. And that sounds crazy. I never expected that I would be saying that the remake of Resident Evil 4 is better than the original, but it 100% is. The remake of Resident Evil 4 is hands down the best Resident Evil game ever, period. There's no contest. And I say that as someone who's loved and played through the series for many years now. Each game in the series I think has its own strengths and weaknesses. Some games have more weaknesses than others, but I think that each game kind of does something special or unique. But really, this remake is the best Resident Evil game. It is the best one. It has the most depth gameplay-wise, it's the most fleshed out, it has probably the best story of a Resident Evil game. They put time and effort and energy into it, and I wasn't expecting the game to make me emotional whatsoever, but it did. It affected me, and that's crazy because this is freaking Resident Evil we're talking about, so it's not Shakespeare or anything, but it still made me feel things. And honestly, any game that can do that gets a big ol' thumbs up for me. It feels like after Resident Evil 7, Capcom wanted to take the series in a more serious direction, and the original games were campy and they were silly, and I'm not the first one to say this, but they were really kind of if B-movie horror movies were turned into games.
What? Don't come this way! No!
And so I remember hearing that this game would be scarier than the original, and it would be more of a horror game. And I think it probably is scarier than the original, and I think it probably is more of a horror game than the original, but I don't think that this is a survival horror title, exactly. I think that like the original, it's very much an action game with a horror bent, so I feel comfortable in calling this an action horror game, but I don't think it's survival horror in the same way that the original Resident Evil games are, or that the original Silent Hill games are, which is fine, because the original Resident Evil 4 was not really a survival horror game. There was never a point in the original game where I was feeling scared of running out of ammo. But I don't mean to downplay some of the more horror-based sections, such as with the Garrador, for instance. His introduction is actually kind of scary. And it feels like with the Garrador, they took him and they made his original entrance something greater, something more memorable. And really, I think that's probably the best way to explain this game, is they took a lot of the core ideas of the original title and they expanded upon them and more fully realized them. And that's the best thing that any remake can do. One thing I need to get out of the way, whenever I played through this game initially, it was on my old PC, which had a GTX 970 in it, and so the game looked like this. And so I have 500 gigs worth of footage that looks like this. And so whenever I built my new PC, I had to record all new footage. But I wanted to play with some of the costumes on. So whenever you see Leon in a big bird costume, that's the game. That's just, it's one of the remake changes, so it's not a costume I added. And Ashley is a scene girl now. And the reason why is because it's more appropriate for the game taking place in 2004. You know, I just thought it would be more appropriate for Ashley to look like someone who would have a copy of Fall Out Boy's first record, or 3 Cheers for Sweet Revenge, or something of that nature. Going from the original Resident Evil 4 to the remake of Resident Evil 4, so much has changed. And almost all of it is for the better, and I absolutely love it. So one of the best things I can say about this game is that at no point did I ever feel bored. The game took me about 25 hours to go through on the hardcore difficulty, and I'm not gonna lie, I was kind of messing around and just playing around and just trying to find everything and whatever. And I don't like most long games, and I made a video about that. But even though this game is on the longer side, there isn't really any fat to trim. There isn't a portion of the game that I wish had been cut or removed or completely rechanged or that's not a word. Completely remixed or anything like that. And a note about the difficulty. It says that if you have played the original Resident Evil 4, then you should play this remake on hardcore. which I 100% agree with. The hardcore difficulty actually poses a bit of a challenge, and not in like a frustrating way, but in more of a you have to learn to get good at the game kind of way. I don't like games that are intended to be frustrating. I don't like games that are intended to punish the player, but this is a difficulty that I think is actually quite fair. It's a hard difficulty, but I never felt discouraged or anything like that. But ultimately, people play games on different difficulties, so do whatever is best for you. So like I was saying, this game is very different from the original Resident Evil 4, but it's still broken up the same way. You know, the first area is the village, the second area is the castle, the third area is the island. But again, certain things have been played with, certain things have been pushed or pulled or mixed around or whatever. Some sections have been cut. So for instance, in the village section of the original game, there is a choice that must be made where you have to choose to go down either the left path or the right path. And the left path has the Bella Chainsaw Sisters, the right path has a chase with El Gigante. And so I remember getting to that point of the remake and being like, oh man, I can't wait to see what they've done with this choice and how they've mixed it up. But instead what they did is they just took away the choice entirely and they make you fight the Bella Sisters. But what they did instead is they replaced the El Gigante section with a chase scene that comes after the Bella Sisters, where you're getting chased by Mendez, and it's actually really, it's not exactly the same as the original section, right? Because the original section had El Gigante, whereas this new section has Mendez, but it's kind of the same in theory. It has the same kind of running away, you know, you gotta get away from the bad guy sort of vibe to it. It threw me off whenever I first played through it, but after playing through it multiple times, I actually really like it. It's a change that feels respectful to the original, and I think that's the best thing that I can say about all the changes made in this game. It felt like this game was made by people who actually cared about and loved and adored the original game. And if my memory serves me correctly, I remember reading where some of the original Resident Evil 4 developers worked on this remake. And so it shows that there was a certain degree of passion found in this project that may not be found in other instances of remakes. Most of the changes and additions were really cool. There were a couple removals that I am kind of disappointed by. For instance, they removed It from the game, the weird boss with the thing on his back and he goes psh, psh. I don't know how to explain him, but I've never loved that boss, but they just completely cut it from the game. There's speculation that they're going to come out with some DLC for Ada, and he is going to be a boss in that, and so it would be cool to see it. It would be cool to see it, but overall the rest of the game is just so fantastic that I don't even care that much. But the game subverts your expectations in ways that are so cool. This is a minor spoiler for the first chapter, but whenever you climb up the tower in the village, in the original game, you can just jump up and down the tower, and it's like a 20-foot drop, 30-foot drop, but they changed it in the remake so that way when Leon goes up the tower and then he walks onto the floor breaks and he falls through. So you can't go up the tower anymore. And it was just this change that was really startling to see because, again, my expectations were completely subverted and I thought I knew what I was getting into, but clearly I did not. And it feels like there were a lot of changes like that, changes that were made for the sake of enhancing the experience as opposed to just changing something for the sake of changing something. So I wanted to talk a little bit about each section. So the first section has the famous chainsaw battle scene before the bell rings, and this section is super intense. It's very intense whenever you first play through it. I don't know how they did it because, again, the layout of that area is more or less the same as the original game. Everything is in the same spot, the shotgun's in the same spot. So it's weird because it feels like you've played through this area a billion times before, but it still has the same intensity of the very first time when you played through the original. And I don't know how they did it, but it's awesome. And there's this industrial kind of track that plays in the background, and I don't know, it's really hype. I've never liked Del Lago, the lake monster, but the fight in this game is much cooler. It's one of those things to where I feel like it's still not spectacular, it's still not my favorite part of the game, but I definitely like it more than the original. My only complaint is that it takes like 500 harpoons to kill Del Lago. Like, I think I counted, and I think it took me like 28, 30 to kill him on the hard difficulty, and that's a lot less than 500. I realize that now, so sorry for my bad math. But this fight is actually really cool because the lake monster will like fly through the air, and it's kind of just fun. I like it. But the coolest thing about it is that after the fight, your boat breaks, but you get another boat. And so then you're able to go around and explore the area, and there are all these new sections of that area that were not in the original game whatsoever. And I spent probably like an hour and a half just exploring the area around the lake on my first playthrough. And they just added so much crap, and it's awesome. And I feel like I'm repeating myself. I feel like I'm just praising the game, but like, that's all you can do. That's all you can do when you're faced with greatness, is you can just recognize the greatness. The dog from the original game, you know, hey, it's that dog. shows up in this one, and he's introduced with the most crazy cutscene I've ever seen, where there are like lightning strikes, and it's way more absurd than the original. And this kind of goes back to the tone of the game being kind of weird, because it does feel more serious at parts, but then at other points it feels a lot dumber than the original game. And this is definitely one of those points where whenever I first saw this cutscene, I was like, this is so stupid. It's so stupid that the lightning would strike right as the wolf, you know, strikes a pose and howls into the air, and then he jumps down, and I don't know, it's just silly, but it's great. It's great, it's super fun. But this is one of the instances that I would like to use to highlight the kind of tonal imbalance, I guess we'll call it, and I'll talk more about that later. Then, like I was talking about with the revamped chainsaw section, they brought back the cabin scene, because of course they did, because it's one of the best parts of the original game, but in this one it's so much more intense. And I can say that about a bunch of different parts of this game, is that they're just so intense. They're so intense, and it's phenomenal. It's an adrenaline rush. The cabin scene actually gave me a lot of trouble, and I kept on dying at it over and over and over, but the game's just so much fun that I didn't even care. After the cabin, you go to the castle, and the castle, to me, feels like the most heavily reworked section of the game, which is weird because I think pretty much every section has been heavily reworked. I think everything about the game has been wildly changed. But whenever I think back on the game, it really is the castle that stands out as the most changed up section. Honestly, I'm just going to throw this out there. The worst thing about the castle is the moment when you go into the castle, because in the original game, there's a truck that comes down, and then you have to shoot the truck, and then it like swerves and crashes into bricks and stuff. And then they took that out of the remake, and instead you just see the truck, but it's all decrepit and worn out, and it's there to be like, see, we remembered the truck, but you don't ever fight the truck. And so I'm like, this is honestly such a minor nitpick, but at the same time, I'm like, I kind of miss the truck. People wanted the Snyder cut of the Justice League. Well, I want the truck cut of Resident Evil 4. I do think that the castle is overall a lot darker and a lot scarier than the original game, and it does feel closer to what an evil cult would kind of inhabit. I mentioned the Garradors, but they're just so much more scary and twisted, and this is one of the few instances where I think the more realistic graphics actually kind of helps the impact that they have on you, as opposed to hurting it or lessening it. Because really, this is a topic for another video, but I think that sometimes less is more. Sometimes having worse graphics allows your imagination to kind of fill in the blanks, but I think here, since the Garradors are presented in, you know, full 4K, you know, whatever, they're scanning people in and putting them into video games now. Because of that, having a man with big Wolverine claws who has had his eyes sewn shut, it's really just kind of harrowing to see. There's a completely new section added to the castle that felt like Dark Souls, where I literally was talking to someone while playing it, and I said, hey, I think I'm playing Dark Souls now. And it's where there's an El Gigante that's throwing crap at you, and you're having to run across a castle wall, and it's great. It's great. So I said earlier that I feel like one of the best things that a remake can do is take what was in the original and more fully realize it and expand it into something better. And I think that's exactly what they did with the Summoner class. In the original game, there was a guy in a red robe with a different mask than everyone else, and there was one guy. But what they did is they took that guy, and then they just made it into an entire enemy class. You can summon the parasites from people's heads, and it's just a change that I never expected to see, but I love it. And it's like, yeah, the guy had such a cool design in the original game that, like, yeah, we should have him show up several times. We should have multiple versions of the same dude, which aren't actually the same dude, but different guys dressed in the same attire, whatever. I thought that for sure they would cut the knights from the game, but they didn't. And I'm glad, because I love the knights, because they're kind of goofy and silly. The knights are just great. The knights are great. The knights are my friends. Yeah. In the original game, Waterhall is an area that is notoriously difficult. In here, they made it a lot grosser. It's a lot more decrepit. The water is not clear, and it's kind of dark and disgusting. Despite some of these massive changes, this game does feel a lot like the original Resident Evil 4, but just as if it were perceived through a completely different lens than the original. This reinterpretation of Ramon Salazar is a great instance of that, because he just feels a lot more gross and disgusting looking than the original. And it's weird because he didn't leave as much of an impression on me as the original one did, even though they did beef up his backstory and they made it more tragic and sad. He just didn't have the same resonance as the guy being like, Mr. Kennedy, my name is Ramon. I don't know any other lines by him. Then they introduced the novistadores in the castle, who are the giant invisible bugs. It feels like they play a different role than they did in the original game, because in the original game, they feel more tanky and beefy, but in here, they're super weak, and you can kill them in a couple of shots usually, but they are deadly. They are super quick and they are very deadly. So it's like, it takes a couple hits to kill them, but it also takes a couple hits to kill you. It's kind of fair. I like it. Much like the knights, I was scared that they would cut this, but fortunately they did keep the minecart section. They just made it way dumber. It's so much dumber than the original, and it's just very funny because of it. Because yeah, there are plenty of people who are like, oh yeah, with the Resident Evil 4 remake, they turned the game more serious, and then you get to this point, and it's like, why does this feel like Donkey Kong Country? Like, that's not even a joke. Why does this feel like Donkey Kong Country? Because in the original game, you were in a minecart that was attached to 2 other minecarts, and you could jump between them, and then dudes were trying to jump into your minecart. But in this one, it's literally, there are people on other tracks who are trying to chase you, and it just feels like Indiana Jones, and I'm like, this is silly. This is silly. It's funny. I like it. But like, let's not kid ourselves. This is a million times dumber than the original minecart section. And it's great. It's great. So the room with 2 Garradors is still in this game, fortunately. In this game, it's a million times more intense. And the way that they made it more intense was by making one tiny weensy change. You see, in the original game, when you walk into this room, there are 2 Garradors, and then there are like 4 or 5 cultists, just some fodder enemies. And it's the exact same thing in this remake. But the thing is, those guys respawn. They have fodder enemies that jump down and come into the room with you, and so it's very intense. It's very intense because it's like there are like 20 people in the room now. It's a lot to handle. But really, this is an instance of another phenomenal change where all they did was they tweaked one thing. They tweaked one thing about the original, and they made it a million times better. Then after the castle, you have the island. Overall, I think that the island feels like the least reworked section of the game, which is weird because the island is far and away the most hated part of the original game. But still, there are some pretty major changes. So for instance, they took out the guys with the miniguns and they replaced them with the dudes with the warheads. They added some laser puzzles that are cool. They added some cave systems. I like it. The regenerators are back, and they've reworked them to be able to turn into Iron Maidens, who are the spiky regenerators from the original. Well, you know, that was how it was in the original game, where there were 2 separate classes of enemies. But in this one, the Iron Maidens are just regenerators that regenerated and grew spikes for some reason. I don't really understand why. It's a very intense change. It's very intense, and it's very startling because you never know when it's going to happen. They brought back Mike. If you don't know who Mike is, he's the guy that says, ha ha ha, drinks are on me, and then immediately dies and gets blown up. If you don't know who Mike from the original game is, then you're not a real Resident Evil 4 fan. I attend weekly Resident Evil 4 meetings, and that's the first thing that they always ask newcomers. Do you know who Mike is? And if they say no, we kill them. So they added side quests to the game because every horror game series is doing that now, where they just have side quests. You did have a side quest in the original game, which was where you shot the blue medallions, and then you would shoot like 9 of the 15, and then you would get the Punisher, which is a gun that lets you shoot through people. So I think they added the side quest so that way Leon could have a little bit of fun while he's trying to catch Ashley. So it's like, Leon, can you catch this big fish? Leon, can you throw an egg at this portrait of Ramon Salazar? Leon, can you shoot 6 different sets of blue medallions? I'm making the side quests sound really silly, and they are, but they're also fun. Some of my favorite side quests are the ones that make you go back to an area you've already been to, and the reason why is because there's like a super tough, hardcore enemy there. So in the castle, for instance, you have to go back to an area, and there's a golden knight there, and he's very tough. He's very tough and very hard, and I like it because I like the knights. Normally, I tend to think that side quests are lazy and just kind of content for the sake of content, but I had fun doing all the side quests in Resident Evil 4, and I did do all the side quests in Resident Evil 4. The quests are given to you by the merchant, and that really kind of helps deepen his characterization a bit because he always has a description for each side quest that is written by him, and so I really like that aspect of it. Most of the weapons are the same in this game. They did add in a bowgun. It's weak, it's garbage, but you can recover the bolts that you shoot dudes with, and so if you're running out of ammo, then you can just shoot them like 12 times with a bowgun and then kill them and then run up and then take the arrows out of their corpse, and then you can reload them into your bowgun, and then you can shoot the other guy 12 more times and then take the arrows out of his corpse and then reload them into your bowgun. And so that aspect of it is pretty cool. It's a cool trade-off. The only problem is that it looks real goofy whenever you're just shooting at a guy repeatedly with a bowgun, because it's a slow death, you know? It's the guy's standing there and he's like, can you just shoot me with a normal gun, please? And you're like, no, I need to save ammo, so I'm shooting you with the bowgun. And he's like, can you please shoot me fewer than 500 times with the bowgun? And then you're like, no, I need to shoot you 500 times with the bowgun. Still, the Red 9 is the best pistol. This is not up for debate. The Red 9 is still number one. People hated Ashley in the original game for a number of reasons, but specifically they hated the gameplay sections with her because you had to protect her and you had to watch her health, and if she got hit, then you would have to use some of your green herbs on her. But in this game, she isn't that big of a problem. Okay, so most Resident Evil puzzles are for babies. Most Resident Evil puzzles are dumb. They are, can you please turn the thing and put it into the slot? But then there are a couple puzzles in this that were legitimately mind-boggling. So for instance, there's this like twisty, turny puzzle. It's easy on the normal difficulty, but if you do the hardcore one, then they change up the solution to it. And it took me a good 10 or 15 minutes to solve the puzzle the first time I played through it. And then I got a treasure that was not worth it. Ultimately, it was not worth the time investment, but I got it. But yeah, there's that hexagon puzzle that's super hard, and then there are these weird twisty laser ones that look very easy because all you have to do is you have to make the power go into the power sections, the power slots, or what, I don't know. You make the power go into the power boxes. And so it seems super easy on paper, and it is easy on paper, but then whenever you're actually trying to do them, some of them are just, it's like, am I stupid? Am I stupid for not being able to solve this? Do I need to go back to second grade? So one change about this game is that the knife breaks, and that was very worrying to me, considering that the gameplay loop of the original game was that you shoot a guy in the face, you kick him, and then you repeatedly stab him until he dies. That's what the gameplay loop is for the first game. And so in making your knife break, they took that away. And so they made it to where you actually have to play the game in a manner that is more fun. But yeah, the knife breaks because you can parry dudes, you can parry axes from the air, you can parry a chainsaw. It's just, I never wanted a parry in a Resident Evil game, but now that I have it, I can't go back. It's really cool that Dante from Devil May Cry taught Leon how to use Royal Guard, and I don't really know when he did that, but it's cool to see. And okay, this is a bit of a side note, but like Resident Evil has always been super violent, right? Like it's a horror series and it's about body horror and it's about people turning into disgusting, horrific monsters and people killing each other and people destroying entire cities and blah, blah, blah. It's gross. It's violent. We know. But still, I was shocked by the level of violence in this game because I was not expecting to see Leon stab dudes in the neck. I was not expecting to see Leon stab old ladies in the neck repeatedly. And I don't know why, but it caught me off guard. I was just surprised. And I don't have a problem with it, but I was just like, wow, this game actually is violent. This game does deserve to be rated M. This game should not be played by children. In addition to the parry system, they added stealth in, so you can walk up behind dudes and then stab them in the neck. I like it a lot. It's just like The Last of Us kind of thing, but it's great. This game made me realize how much of a loot goblin I am because there are a billion treasures everywhere scattered throughout the map, and I had to have every treasure ever. And there's this entire treasure system where you can combine treasures together. You can fit jewels into different treasures, such as necklaces or crowns or whatever. And they kind of had that in the original game where you could combine certain jewels with certain other pieces. But in this system, it's so much more complicated. And I spent, I don't know how much time trying out different combinations of jewels for different treasures. And I would not be surprised to learn that a substantial amount of my time spent in Resident Evil 4 was just messing around with treasures. They also beefed up the shooting gallery. It's a lot more complicated and has more levels to it, but I would still love to see more. I would love to see some DLC shooting gallery levels, and that sounds silly because most people would probably want actual levels as opposed to shooting gallery levels, but the shooting gallery is a lot of fun. Yeah, I would pay for a merchant level pack. So the way they handled the story of this game is really interesting to me because, like I mentioned before, tonally they tried to make it more serious in some ways, and so Leon's characterization is reflective of that change. So Leon went from being a cool guy to an unhappy cool guy. He feels more cynical, he feels more depressed, he feels like he doesn't have time for anyone's crap. It's a really interesting take on Leon, and it took me a bit to warm up to it because it is so different from the action hero Leon that we're used to from the original Resident Evil 4, but I think it works. And I don't know if depressed is the right word to use for him, but I definitely think he feels more like an actual person as opposed to kind of a cartoon character, which is what the original Resident Evil 4 Leon feels like in a lot of ways.
No thanks, bro.
And that's not a bad thing. You know, it's just a thing. It's a style difference. And again, I think this interpretation of Leon probably fits more in line with the kind of serious tone that they've been going for. But still, in spite of the fact that they made him more serious, Leon still has a bunch of campy jokes. He still has a bunch of goofy one-liners. One of my favorites is Nighty Night Nights, and it's just silly, and so I like it. But I think it kind of goes back to the tone problem that I was discussing earlier, where at times it feels more serious, but then at times it feels like they're leaning more into the campiness of classic Resident Evil. It didn't break the game for me, it didn't ruin the game for me, the fact that I think the tone feels a little bit unbalanced, but it's certainly something to think about, I guess. One of my favorite things about this version of Leon is the fact that they took great pains to try to connect him back to the Resident Evil 2 version of Leon. And that sounds like a stupid thing to say, because the Leon from Resident Evil 2 and the Leon from Resident Evil 4 are the same person, just 6 years apart. But at the same time, I never really connected Resident Evil 4 Leon to Resident Evil 2. Like, I've always known that they're supposed to be the same character, but I didn't see them as the same character in my head. Whereas with this remake version of Leon, I think it's a lot easier to connect the two and to draw a line between them. At one point in the game, you find a picture of Leon in his police uniform, and that was really kind of the point where I was like, oh, like, the connection has been made in my mind. But then it is kind of weird because, again, Leon is more serious, he is more cynical, but at the same time, he's constantly doing backflips for no reason, and so it feels like they wanted to take Leon in a more serious direction, and it feels like they did, but at the same time, it feels like they needed him to be the goofy original version of Leon. They needed him to be recognizable to fans of the original game. So it feels like there's a tug of war going on between what they want Leon to be and then the role that Leon played in the original game. In the same way that they connected Resident Evil 2 Leon to Resident Evil 4 Leon more clearly, there are some minor changes made to this game that just make the series as a whole feel much more interconnected. The original Resident Evil 4 did always kind of feel weird in the light of the original games, because with the first 3 games and with Code Veronica, they're all focused around zombies and they're all focused around Umbrella and Raccoon City in a lot of ways, minus Code Veronica. But with Resident Evil 4, it just feels like a completely different thing. It just feels like, oh yeah, screw the zombies, we're doing parasites now, screw Raccoon City because it got blown up, we're going off to Europe now. And it just felt like a complete change. It felt like a complete change in direction. And Capcom recognized that, and so they tried to take some pains to connect the games more closely. One of my favorite changes is just the fact that Luis worked on the team that made Nemesis in the 3rd game. And that's just such a mind-boggling change, and it's wild, and I love it. I'm like, this is brilliant. This is a brilliant change because it makes everything feel more connected. And going back to talking about Ashley, I was never someone who hated Ashley in the original game. But this version of Ashley is just so much better. It's so much better. She's so much more endearing. She actually feels like someone who wants to escape. She feels like someone who actually wants to get back home and is willing to fight her way back home. She's terrified, she's scared, she's in a bad situation, but she's still willing to help out Leon. She's still willing to take steps to try to save not only herself, but him as well. And so her and Leon just have this really excellent dynamic that builds up over the course of the game, and it's just really wonderful to see. And I'm hoping that we see her again in future games or in some kind of piece of media in the future. Then I wanted to talk about Luis and Krauser, but I wanted to talk about them together. And that feels like a weird thing because I never really felt like the two were connected much in the original game. In fact, I always kind of felt like Krauser was just kind of thrown in there at the end of the original game. But in this game, Krauser is much more built up, and in this game, Luis is much more built up. And they're kind of foils to one another. Krauser is essentially a good guy turned bad, and Luis is essentially a bad guy turned good. And so I think there's probably a lot to be said about that dynamic. So if you see a future video by me that is all about Luis and Krauser, just don't be surprised, I guess. And I mentioned earlier that this game made me very emotional at some points. And one of those instances was a part where Sadler comes into the room, and this is like the first time you actually see him in person, if I'm not mistaken. And he is controlling Ashley and tries to make her shoot Leon. And it's like, you know Leon's not going to die. You know he's going to be okay. They're not going to completely change the story and kill off Leon in the remake, whereas they didn't in the original. They're not going to do something like that. And in spite of knowing that, like, seeing the scene where Sadler tries to force Ashley to kill Leon was just, it almost made me cry. And I don't know, it's weird. It's weird being affected by a Resident Evil game like that. Talking about Sadler, Sadler is definitely one of those characters who they pushed in a more horrific direction. Just with his design, and then he's surrounded by these women with their heads covered, and they're really kind of spooky. And then I don't have a great segue into this, but I love how they handled Leon and Ada's relationship in this game. In the original game series, it's like Leon is in love with Ada, even though she's lied to him and betrayed him and used him over and over and over again. But in this one, he doesn't do anything of the sort. He's just completely distrustful of her. He knows she's a snake, he knows that she's a liar, and that she's selfish, and that she only does things for herself, and so he kind of stays at arm's length because of it. It feels like a healthy change, honestly, because it feels like that's what you should be doing whenever someone is mistreating you, is you should be kind of distant and not, you know, pining for them. You shouldn't be in love with them or whatever. And so I think the treatment of Ada and Leon's relationship is a major reason why I actually really dig this version of Leon, is just because of the fact that he is cynical, he is distrustful of other people, he knows that there are forces beyond him that are trying to screw him over and just make a mess of the world. But yeah, their relationship is absolutely one of my favorite changes. Just the handling of it, I think, is so much better than the original. And then I don't really have a spot to talk about this, but the mercenaries mode, which was an update, is great. This is the best mercenaries mode that they've done in a Resident Evil game, except for maybe 5, because that one had co-op. So I would really love to see some kind of co-op mercenaries for Resident Evil 4. Really, I just want a game that is just mercenaries, which they already did years ago for the Nintendo 3DS, but they didn't port it to any other consoles. Capcom keeps on trying to turn Resident Evil into some kind of multiplayer series. You know, they keep on trying to make these Dead by Daylight clones, and they fail every single time. Not a single one has succeeded. And so I'm telling you right now, Capcom, I'm not the first one to say this, but I will tell you, if you want a big multiplayer hit, just turn the mercenaries into a full-on, like, big multiplayer game. That's all you have to do. That's all you have to do. Take what you have already. You have the base for mercenaries. Just put every Resident Evil character in it. Make it co-op, make it multiplayer. Have some kind of game mode where people compete against each other, which I think they had in Resident Evil 5 and maybe 6. But just take the mercenaries, turn it into its own thing. That's all you have to do. That's all you have to do to have a big multiplayer smash. And you're welcome. So really, I don't have too many bad things to say about the Resident Evil 4 remake. Like I said, there are a couple things that they cut. I miss the truck. I miss it. Ada's voice actress is not very good, but every other character is great. So whatever, I guess. You gotta pick your battles. But on the whole, I was not expecting anything from this remake. And so to receive an improvement on the best game ever is just really incredible to see. So here's a question. At the end of the day, does this replace the original Resident Evil 4? I think that my answer to this is probably. There's a lot to love about the original Resident Evil 4, and I'm going to be quoting it until the day I die, and that's a promise.
If you don't need me, then get off my back, old man.
But really, I think that this game is just, it does so many things better than the original, and again, like, that's crazy to say because the original is so freaking good. But really, I think this remake is better than the original game. I think it's better than any other Resident Evil game. And I never expected I would say that. But here we are. Here we are. It's a weird time to live in. You know, this isn't the original game with a new, fresh coat of paint. This is the original game completely reimagined and rebuilt from the ground up. And it's better because of it. It's better because of the changes they made to it. I was thinking about this the other day. I was kind of thinking about how, you know, maybe I should go back and replay the original Resident Evil 4. But then I just booted up the remake and started playing that instead, and I was having a blast with it, like literally an hour or two before I started filming this video. But yeah, I think this is an instance where normally it's a horrible idea to try to tinker with greatness, but they tinkered with greatness with the original Resident Evil 4, and they made something that was even greater. So I guess that sometimes it does kind of work out, even if I still think it's probably a bad idea to mess with greatness overall. So I'm saying this is the best Resident Evil game, and I think it is. But at the same time, part of me kind of mourns the fact that we might not see anything like the Resident Evil 7 and 8 games, because those games were kind of taking Resident Evil in a very different direction, I think. And so I think that with the success of these remakes, I think that we're probably going to see more games closer to the original games, closer to these remakes, than we are going to see stuff that's closer to the Ethan Winter duology, I guess. But really, this game is just too good to be denied. It's too good to say that anything else is better than it, because nothing else is better than it. This is number one. So I think Capcom has had an absolutely wonderful string of Resident Evil games since 2017 with the launch of Resident Evil 7. And so there's a question in my mind, can it continue? Can they continue the success that Resident Evil has had with Resident Evil 9, whenever that comes out in a couple years, presumably, or Resident Evil 5, which it seems like they're going to remake? Can this continue, basically, is my question. And I don't know. I don't know, because part of me wants to say no. Part of me wants to say that we've arrived, you know, we've hit the peak. But at the same time, I never thought that we would get here. I never thought that the Resident Evil 4 remake would be even good, much less great. So I'm open to anything, I guess. So I'm excited for the future of Resident Evil as a game series, and I'm excited to see where it goes and what the company does with it next. But yeah, it's crazy because I remember when people were begging Capcom to remake Resident Evil 2, and here we are now with them all but having confirmed a Resident Evil 5 remake. And I don't know, it's just wild. It's crazy how time flies. But yeah, I think that this is the best Resident Evil has ever been. I think that this is the best string of games that Resident Evil has ever had, from 7 till the remake of 4. And I think that this is the best Resident Evil game. So if you don't give a crap about Resident Evil, you should still play it. And if you do give a crap about Resident Evil, then you should definitely play it. And you probably have played it. And if you have played it already, then you should replay it because it's that good. So in conclusion, I love Resident Evil 4, and I think it is probably the best game that I will play for the next couple of years, honestly. So thank you, and have a nice night.